That was dealing with the past. Today we are dealing with the future.
Tonight, it's the funding announcement First Nations have been waiting for on education, but is the deal a good one? There's mixed reaction and everyone is weighing in. And we'll have this story.
I'm Shannon Robinson in Brantford, Manitoba, where a high school student says he's been punished for practicing his culture. I have that story coming up on APTN National News.
Tonight, we'll take you to the press conference on the Kainai Nation in southern Alberta regarding on-reserve education held by Prime Minister Stephen Harper and National Chief Sean Atleo. An agreement was made that centered around a promise to give control over First Nation education back to First Nation people. It also came with a packet of cash, over $1.2 billion over 3 years, but that cash won't flow until 2016. Other promises include $500 million for infrastructure, $160 million for implementation of the agreement, and an annual 4.5 increase in funding. Here are some of the highlights from today's announcement.
I'm therefore delighted to announce that after unprecedented consultations, our government has reached an agreement with National Chief Atleo and the Assembly of First Nations to move forward together with comprehensive reform of First Nations education through new legislation entitled the First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act. The Act will provide the legislative base required to ensure that youth on reserve have access to the education they need and deserve. One that is portable and meets provincial standards, incorporates Aboriginal language and culture, and ensures First Nations communities themselves have the primary responsibility for day-to-day management of schools. The legislation will end Ottawa's unilateral authority over First Nations education, while requiring First Nation communities and parents to assume responsibility and accountability for the education their children receive. And I should mention that the upcoming budget, Economic Action Plan 2014, will provide full funding for the new system. This Act does one more thing. It will finally repeal the provisions of the Indian Act that established residential schools. Therefore, friends, this truly is the beginning of a historic new path, not just for First Nations, but for all Canadians.
We are, as has been referenced, here to commemorate a new way forward. So important, so as to understand the mistakes that were made in the past, like was just said here, one of the worst examples of unilateral control. And Minister, I can't help but reflect on your words, where it sounds to me like you're asking to be removed from the responsibility. And I know you don't take it personally when we say we welcome the opportunity for you to be removed from the education, hand it over to the people. This is the work that we're describing here at this moment. And there is work that will have to be done.
We have a team on the Blood Tribe Reserve. Watching all the events today is APTN's Keith Labucan. Keith, some say it's a historic day.
That's right, Michael. We're here at the Kainai High School where a major agreement has just been announced between the Government of Canada and the Assembly of First Nations. That's in regards to the First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act. Now with today's announcement, there are three main components. $1.25 billion over 3 years. That begins in 2016-2017 for the core funding component. $500 million over 7 years, beginning in 2015-2016 for infrastructure, and also $160 million over 4 years, beginning in 2015-2016 for the implementation fund. Now, Sean Atleo was one of the first speakers to take to the podium, and here's what he had to say.
Oh, it's full respect for the right for every First Nation to lead the way for the implementation of their treaties. There is no bill. The agreement that's being referenced is the federal government, as the Prime Minister said, responding to the Chiefs' resolution this December, that the First Nations control be respected, that there be sustainable, guaranteed funding. We've heard a funding announcement here today, that there be no unilateral oversight. They've committed to that, and that these areas have to be worked on together, including, importantly, resources for language and culture. So it is up to First Nations to design their approach, to implement their approach, and the federal government has signaled both an openness to join together in designing how this framework would go forward, as well as regulations. So it's completely up to First Nations, and my commitment is to stand in support of every First Nations to do so.
Sorry, Chief Atlee, I know you probably just answered this, but some of us are linked to this, but there has been opposition, there has been people who have been concerned that there hasn't been proper consultation. I'm going to ask you something really odd. If you could look that way while answering it, because that's what my point is, that would be great.
So what's important to note is that the previous proposal has been rejected by the Chiefs in Assembly. That what we're hearing the government commit to is a new way forward, that we jointly design an approach to education. So there is no bill. I think that's the first thing to make really clear. There is no First Nations Education Act. The idea of there being First Nations control and there being sustainable funding, that has to be anchored in legislation. And the federal government has signaled an openness to have First Nations join in forging how that will look, as well as fully participating in joint regulation. This means getting the Minister of Indian Affairs out of our lives on education, as well as having fair funding and oversight that's First Nations themselves designed. So those are important signals, and every First Nations will have the responsibility to designing their systems and implementing their systems. So this is giving effect to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Articles 14 and 15. It says that every First Nation has the right to design their own approach to education.
Why would there be opposition to that?
Well, the previous bill was absolutely rejected, and I think until the work is underway to demonstrate the good faith that was expressed here, I think everyone will reserve the right, given the history of governments, unilateral decision-making, and that's the reason why it's been anchored in ceremony, just like it was done in the time of treaty, that the words that were spoken must now be put into effect. And it's through the work, and I think it's still building trust is required.
This is being framed as a draft bill, though. So I mean, and it's something that you support. So why do you support this, and would you support it without any changes?
I would. Well, as was expressed here, the federal government has agreed that they must meet the 5 conditions that the First Nations set out in Assembly at the resolution at the December Special Chiefs Assembly. 5 very quickly. First Nations control and jurisdiction. They have to honor that. Statutory guarantee that closes the gap on funding. They've expressed that here today. Support for languages and cultures. Residential schools tried to take it away, literally ripping it from our kids. Move away from unilateral oversight. That means also getting the Minister of Indian Affairs out of our lives on education, and so First Nations will be in control. And lastly, ongoing meaningful dialogue. That means not only consultation, but the right to free, prior, and informed consent has to be achieved. So the objectives here are absolutely very high, and there's still so much work that has to be done. These commitments now, the decision amongst First Nations is to whether to engage in these discussions and to move into with the federal government into a partnership to reform systems and receive new resources that will transform education.
Okay, this Houle says that the treaty is all.
But not everybody that attended today's announcement was thrilled with the news between the Prime Minister and the Assembly of First Nations. This protester actually stood up and raised her concerns.
Chief Atlee, I must, on behalf of my people of Treaty 6 territory, Sarah Lake Cree Nation, as a mother and a grandmother, I must let you know that I object, our nation objects to this FNEA. You do not have the right, on behalf of Treaty 6 members, as a descendant of Treaty 6, the Chief of God, to speak on behalf of treaty, on behalf of our nation. I must let the nations know that we object to this agreement. And I must make that public. And to let Canada know, not every First Nation has been consulted or has been part of these negotiations. As a grandmother and a mother, And of these lands, we have fully objected from the beginning of this First Nations Education Act. The reason that we object is that AFN has no jurisdiction to speak on treaty on our behalf, because treaty is a nation-to-nation agreement, and the successor state of Canada cannot, under any circumstances, go into another agreement that was already signed in 1876. We already had an education clause in there to protect us, to help us, and not to replace our education laws and our ways of knowing in place of another foreign system. And that's what has been happening.
Other than whose responsibility is to negotiate something like this, is there something specific?
They need to be speaking with us. Because what we've been asking from the beginning, from day one since 1876, is the opportunity to maintain our culture, our languages. We already have our laws. We've already educated our people. We know what we need. And we're tired of people telling us how to educate our people. I'm a descendant of a residential school. I know what that is. And then I will not accept monies that's going to be coming and taking away from our other programs and our other organizations. As a leader, we're suffering already. They're already pulling funds from other organizations. Where's this money that's going to come from? That's what I have to ask, because as far as I'm concerned, all this legislation is doing is dictating to us. Every agreement, when you look at them, it says that at their discretion, they have to approve. Why do they have to approve on our lands? We are an indigenous nation from these lands. Everyone else is a visitor. Is a settler.
To imagine that the federal government's going to independently negotiate a separate treaty with all treaties signed? I mean, is that just logistically? Does that make sense?
You know what? There's no negotiation. All it is saying they're supposed to maintain and honor their side of the treaty agreement. That's what we've been saying from day one. Have they? No, they've tried to assimilate us. Indian Act policy tried to replace our treaties. Our people are not even knowing, some of them, the difference between Indian Act and treaty. Treaty is who we are. That's what we signed before treaty. We've been sovereign. We'll be sovereign to this day forward. Indian Act has always been to assimilate us. I'm sorry, we don't have special status. We have inherentancy. We come from these lands. We didn't come from across the border.
And of course, it was a very big day, a monumental step forward in terms of what can be accomplished for First Nations education on reserve. I spoke to a leader who says they'll now take the information, study it further, and go from there. Michael, back to you.
Coming up, commentary from the Liberal Aboriginal Affairs critic. Now here's your first look at tomorrow's weather.